Well, that's just what big toilet paper wants you to think, but in the end, you really can never be prepared for what's going to happen if you run out. I mean, it doesn't matter how much you try to stockpile, you're always going to eventually run out of toilet paper. There's no replacement for it. I mean, like, yeah, you could use your hand if you really want to and just, like, wash it, but hey, you can't sleep? Me neither. I have something I want to talk to you about. Come on. The Disney Dark Age was a period between... Actually, give me 1 second. That's better. The Disney Dark Age was a period of time between 1968 and 1987 in which, historians agree, the company was just an all-around bummer. Walt had died and was freshly in the ground in 1966, leaving what is commonly known as a daddy gap. And largely, the creative decisions that they made during this time were in attempts to find the same kind of magic that Walt had. There was Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which tried to find the same kind of audience as Mary Poppins. Fox and the Hound, which was an attempt at the same kind of what if animals, but sad, as Bambi. There was The Black Hole, which, Star Wars? Largely, these attempts were a critical and commercial failure. The daddy gap remained unfilled, and every time they tried to Ouija Walt, the planchette just pointed to age. What did it all mean? You see, they forgot a very important lesson that Walt had taught them long ago.
I only hope we never lose sight of one thing, that it was all started by a mouse.
Not that one. Cute, not that one either. There he is. There's my boy. You see, most of you who know me, which is to say, none of you, know that I am mainly a horror freak and horror-adjacent media. I don't really get into Disney that often. I have a few favorites that I kind of tend to stick to, but beyond that, not really my thing. However, I have something to say. Something that I've felt very strongly for a very long time. This may be a little bit controversial, but I think you should hear me out. You see, The Great Mouse Detective is the only film. Still with me? Perfect. Let's begin. The original 5 Basil of Baker Street books were written between 1958 and 1982 by Titus, and they follow the titular mouse, Basil of Baker Street, and his life partner and trusted associate, Dr. David Q. Dawson, as they solve crimes from beneath and within the walls of 221B Baker Street, also known as the fictional home of private consulting detective Sherlock Holmes and his boyfriend, John Watson. Now, the film follows the plot of none of these books. In fact, a lot of the characters are very much different from the original cast, but we'll get back to that later. To sum up the movie, it goes a little bit like this. Get the lights, will you?
Olivia Flaversham and hot single dad Hiram Flaversham are celebrating Olivia's birthday in Hiram's toy store when he is kidnapped by a disabled bat named Fidget. Olivia, lost after a night of wandering London in search of that famous Detective Basil of Baker Street, runs into Dr. David Q. Dawson, an army doctor back from war in Afghanistan. They meet Basil, an eccentric private detective, who only accepts the case once Olivia reveals that the kidnapper is an employee of Rodigan, Basil's arch nemesis, and we'll talk more about that later. Together, the 3 of them, along with Toby the hound dog, except for the fact that canonically, he actually lives 5 miles away. Together, the 3 of them, along with Toby the hound dog, investigate a human toy store for clues on Fidget and Rodigan's whereabouts. Olivia is taken from the toy store by Fidget after another jump scare, but not before he drops a list that helps Basil follow them back to the waterfront pub. He and Dawson, in adorable disguises, witness a mouse burlesque, are drugged, and accidentally cause a brawl before following Fidget back to Ratigan's lair. However, Ratigan was patiently awaiting Basil and promptly flirts with him in front of all of his pals before engaging in a little bit of rope play and serenading him to death. Basil, being a genius, disables the trap and saves his friends' lives just in time for a selfie. They follow Ratigan to Queen Massatoria's Diamond Jubilee, where Ratigan has nearly successfully duped an entire nation with the Robo-Queen and become their supreme ruler. And of course, Basil has to stop him and recite all the ways that Ratigan is a big dum-dum who isn't at all interesting or attractive in any way to him, and so Ratigan naturally throws a tantrum, and he flees, but not before stealing Olivia away as collateral. Basil, Hiram, and Dawson gather party balloons and the flag, chasing Ratigan's dirigible into Big Ben. A fight ensues in the clock's gears, devolving Ratigan to his most base animal instincts as he rips and claws through the tower, and then Basil, finally knocking him off the hands of the clock just before 10 p.m. strikes, aka Britain's bedtime. Of course, when it does strike 10, Ratigan is out past curfew, so the clock throws him to his grave. Basil, however, has fallen into the dirigible's propeller and uses it to hover up to safety. Olivia goes home with her father, the Queen is saved, and Basil lures Dawson into becoming his life partner. Okay, you can put the lights back on.
This movie has everything. Terror, suspense, charismatic and complicated characters, fantastically nuanced and bombastic voice acting, perhaps even a little romance. Like I said, we'll get to it. You see, I'm something of a dork. I don't go out much, even in the before times, and I have 2 friends that I try my best not to embarrass myself in front of. Last year, when I was going through a particularly bad time in my life, I returned to comfort items from childhood, one of which was this movie. I used to have it on VHS, and I would play it on loop in my bedroom and just watch it over and over and over, especially on days such as Christmas when tensions ran high in my household. It was highly formative to my personality and my interests as I grew up, and inspired me to read the whole of the Sherlock Holmes canon. In fact, when I was 14, I took a trip to London and I sought out 221 Baker Street, only to find out that it was completely made up. It's not a real address. It never was. Thank you, Arthur Conan Doyle, for the lies. In fact, the Sherlock Holmes Museum that now claims that address is actually located at 239 B, or not even B, 239 Baker Street, proving that you should never believe in anything ever. Anyways, last year, when I was rediscovering my obsession for this movie, I went online looking for more content about it, and I found some things. I was able to find fan fiction, some fan art, a lot of horniness, especially about Miss Kitty. There was some cosplay, the usual furry stuff, but when it came to video content, I found it completely lacking and rather dry. Many Disney movies have gotten the video essay treatment, where people do something like this. They delve into the movie and what it means and the themes in it. Most of those are either newer films or Disney princesses, which have their place. I'm not against that. They'll talk about how the princess tropes are difficult to reconcile these days, and how now Disney is overdoing its backpedaling on the previous trope. I digress. When it came to The Great Mouse Detective, all I could find were reviews. And most of them kind of said the exact same thing. They followed the same script of talking about the Disney Dark Age, how The Little Mermaid was the first film in the official Disney Renaissance, but how The Great Mouse Detective was pretty much the first commercial success in several years for Disney, and should be considered a little bit higher on the list Most would bring up the fact that Disney had an incredibly well-done CGI fight scene from within Big Ben, which was heavily inspired by the Castle of Cagliostro, Hayao Miyazaki's feature film debut, and another film in the Lupin III franchise, a franchise that similarly made me aspire to be a snarky, well-dressed twink.
I'm ready whenever you are, Count. Come and get me.
Now, there were some mentions of how strongly queer-coded Ratigan is, usually in larger videos dissecting how Disney would rainbow tint a lot of its evil characters at the time. There was some mention of the strong sexual tension between Basil and Ratigan, usually talking about how Basil has this portrait of Ratigan pristine, untouched on his mantelpiece, and who would keep such a devilishly handsome picture of the person they hate the most in such a visible place? Would you excuse me for a minute?
Where was I? Oh yes. Now, they were all pretty much doing the same thing. A cursory review, and I can't fault them for that. They did a great job at it. But I have already seen the movie. I needed in-depth content. I had this giant mouse-shaped hole where it needed to go. And what do when nothing fills our holes? We fill our holes ourselves. I stand true to my assertion that The Great Mouse Detective, despite my childhood bias, has some of the most interesting and clever world building of all the Disney canon. In the first moment of the film, we learn everything we need to know about this society. It's London, people exist, and mice just have a smaller version of the same society that is already there. See, there's Flaversham's shop. It's right beneath a human toy store, it's just smaller. Dawson comes in on a tiny little carriage that's right beneath a big carriage. There's also Tiny Mouse Wars, which comes with all the atrocities of war. Only smaller, covered in fur. Anyways, that's it. Done and done. That's all we really need to know. As well, it introduces the characters expertly and efficiently. Olivia is a sweet little mouse child who loves her father even more than she loves birthday presents, saying that she already had the best birthday ever and she didn't even get anything yet. Dawson is just a big old softie with a weird sense of humor. In the first 5 minutes of meeting Basil, we learn everything we need to know about him. He's eccentric, highly intelligent, prone to melodrama, bit of a dandy, possibly racist. More on that later. He is actively invested in the accumulation and search of knowledge, and unlike many Sherlock Holmes adaptations, he is keen to divulge how he discovers what he knows with anyone who will listen. Well, not anyone. He's not too fond of children. And while he is cold to Olivia, he does understand when he's taken his iciness too far, even if he won't directly apologize for it. He will, however, commit to a bit like his life depends on it. Several times throughout the movie, he refers to Olivia in some flub of her last name, and we're led to believe that it's just because he doesn't really care enough to remember. But later on, during the climax, when he shouts down to Hiram, he uses his last name, Flaversham, without having to be reminded of what it is. Then at the very end, when he's saying goodbye to Olivia, he calls her Miss Flangerhanger, and he even pauses before he does it. He just wants to screw with her. In his study in Scarlet, Watson learns that Sherlock's genius stops short of understanding that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. You appear to be astonished, he said, smiling at my expression of surprise. Now that I do know it, I shall do my best to forget it.
He goes on to explain to Watson that he believes the human brain can only hold so much information, and that the Copernican theory of the solar system simply isn't important enough to his work for him to remember. Let's be real, he's a smart guy. He just wants to fuck with him, which is something I truly respect. Yes, to me, Basil is the platonic ideal of antiheroes, in that he's an absolute turd in many respects. He's not really the type of guy you'd want to bring with you to a party, but he's fascinating and charismatic and has just enough empathy to carry a whole movie really on his own. We want to imagine Sherlock with the same qualities either we possess ourselves or as we would like to be. For instance, there's Sherlock Holmes but short, alien life form Sherlock, Sherlock who fucks, Sherlock but woman, Sherlock as a centerfold model, and of course, Sherlock who only listens to surf rock. Nearly every Holmes adaptation strays from the original source material in some way, and Basil is no different. While it takes Sherlock actually dying in the canon to become a nice guy, Basil already has a natural kindness that he suppresses. He covers it up with self-assurance and with a special brand of my IQ is too high to empathize with you. You know, the kind of thing that people love to emulate without a single degree of irony. But Basil can easily recognize when he's taking this too far, such as when Olivia reveals that her mother is gone and that her father is all she has, or when he breaks his own violin and he has to backpedal from yelling at Olivia about it. Or when he softens to Dawson in the toy store when Dawson internalizes the loss of Olivia. Basil's character doesn't really change at all over the course of the movie, but by the end, he does open himself up to the opportunity of being known. Really, the plot of The Great Mass Detective is not fantastic. It's not what keeps me coming back to watch it over and over again. It's the characters. The way they behave and speak, the way they interact. Their voice actors were expertly chosen, and I really can't imagine a better cast to replace them. Alan Young, who was famously the original Scrooge McDuck, uses his authentic Scottish brogue to voice Hiram Flaversham. Kenny Candido, who was a Disney mainstay for his low and gravelly voice, had his pitch raised so he could voice the delightful little maniac Fidget. You can actually hear Candido's real pitch in the bar scene.
Get off, you eight-legged bum.
Now, Val Betton is just so full of warmth. Listening to him is so comforting. It's like a hug and a cup of cocoa. Barry Ingham is heaven sent. His clipped RP accent, his wonderful range of pitches that he slides through like butter. How even as a young child, he was able to help me understand 5th grade reading level words that were challenging, all through his intonation and expression. The way he is able to voice eloquent dialogue so that it is understandable comes from his training with the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Apply the same rule to Shakespeare as I do to my part, and that is listen to what he has to say. Go home, pick up a Shakespeare, read him out loud. What is on the page is only a clue to what it has to be, and it has to be the sound of the human voice saying wonderful words which are encapsulated like perfume of great wisdom and wit and knowledge. Let me give you one example. Just 4 lines of a speech in which people normally say, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end. I've heard it done like that, and you can't understand a word he's talking about. First thing is, he's an appositional writer. He goes for the opposite. He says, first of all, on that side, to be, and then his third word is or. And when he says or, he lights up a different part of your brain. That's what's called apposition, and great writers know this. Or what? Not to be. Come back to your brain. That is the question. Whether it's nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, listen to this word, or done it again, to take arms against the sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. We won't go any further. You can go through the whole speech like that. And he keeps on saying, living is over here, and it's hell. I hate it. I hate the pain. I hate the emotional pain. I hate what life's doing to me. I can think about it, or I can kill myself. If I can kill myself, it's going to be peaceful. And he goes right up to the point of doing it, and suddenly he realizes, oh my God, he says, a chance to dream. Whew. And the rest of the speech is, maybe after we've died, we'll dream. So what he decides to do? He decides to stay alive. And that's Hamlet's problem. What is his problem? He thinks. He thinks too much. And therefore, like most of us, either or, we finish up doing nothing.
If any other actor were cast as Basil, I'm really not sure that they would have been able to convey nearly as much nuance as Ingham had. And many folks, just like myself, have fallen deeply in love with Basil as a result. He's just so endearing. And while I really have no interest in the furrier side of the lewd internet, I gotta say it, Basil's a hottie. In fact, when I was a youth, I was significantly disarmed when I finally saw the reveal of Basil's voice actor, not as the golden-haired, handsome Hugh Grant type that I had imagined, but rather as, well, Barry Ingham. He was 54 years old at the time of the movie's release, and seems like a very nice man. I'm not the only one who feels a small cognitive dissonance upon this realization.
And one little 6-year-old boy with a very deep voice came up to me, holding his mummy's hand, and said, "Hey, mister." I said, "Yes." He said, "You Basil Baker Street?" I said, "Yes, I'm Basil Baker Street." He said, "You don't look like Basil." I said, No, that's because Basil is drawn. They're drawing. Oh. He said, "You don't sound like Basil." I said, "Well, no, that's because I'm putting on a voice as Basil." He said, "Well, talk like him." So I said, "Hello, my dear fellow, I'm Basil Baker Street." He looked up at his mum and said, "Yeah, he's Basil. Ask for his autograph."
While Basil and Dawson have similarly dulcet tones that harken back to the days of Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, Radigan is an entirely original Disney creation who really has no apt comparison. Indeed, there can be no adequate imitation of the great and powerful Vincent Price. Terrific. Vincent Price should really need no introduction, but my brief one is this. He's fucking Vincent Price, our bisexual king of the malefic and the macabre. Vincent Price is a professional villain who was a horror mainstay since his turn as Richard in 1939's The Tower of London. He's also a gourmet cook who has his own cookbook, so take that, Hannibal Lecter. He also has 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame for his contributions to film and radio acting. Now, when he was asked to audition, he did say that if anybody but Disney had asked him, he would have been offended.
When they approached you to audition, that must have been something for someone like you to have to audition.
It was a little alarming. I couldn't believe it, you know. I mean, I thought if they don't know what I sound like by now, I'm in deep trouble.
What's the rat like?
He's very like me. Doesn't take himself too seriously, but he's a villain. He's a villain.
Truly, it's impossible for me to imagine anyone else being able to convey the superb wickedness of Radigan, or to make him so incredibly lovable. To me, this is the perfect Disney villain, in that all he wants to do is be evil and enjoy himself in his evilness. Yes, he does have a rivalry with Basil, where he delights in making sure that his intellectual prowess is understood and appreciated. But he doesn't do crimes just to get Basil's attention like other Moriarty adaptations, and we won't talk about that. In fact, he's dismayed when he finds out that Basil is onto him. And the only time that he returns to his prior excitement is when he realizes that he has the perfect opportunity to outwit Basil once and for all and completely embarrass him. The juxtaposition of these two brilliant minds is the whole point of the movie, and even though we don't see them interact directly for more than mere minutes of screen time, their rivalry is deeply felt throughout, and it colors all aspects of the story. Not to mention, there is a certain degree of chemistry. I think it's time to take this conversation to the queer corner.
Full disclosure, I have a type. I am what can be commonly referred to as a villain fucker. If you were to go through my AO3 history, which don't do that, you'd see a lot of the same tropes. It's either best friends realize that they've been married the entire time, or big villain is completely irresistible to small protagonist. And this movie has both. So it's really no wonder why I turned out the way that I did. If we are going to accept that Radigan is queer-coded, as we should, I think we should also accept that Basil is coded with very much the same signifiers. Neither of them is traditionally masculine in a heteronormative sense. They both tend to display a vain preoccupation with the way that they appear, their dress, their manner. They're very flamboyant. They gesticulate in a dramatic way. Hell, Radigan is shown only to drink champagne, pink champagne, throughout the whole movie. Yeah. They're both consummate bachelors with zero interest in women. During the bar scene, we do see bisexual icon Dawson lusting after Miss Kitty on stage, but Basil really doesn't pay any attention. Fidget, on the other hand, is super cute. Look at him, he's just like so transfixed the whole time. I know that I haven't really touched on Miss Kitty a lot during this video, but it's really just because it's just too horny. I mean, whoever animated her really wanted to fuck that mouse, and same. Beauty of bisexuality. The relationship between Watson types and Sherlock types is pretty constant throughout all adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes canon, and we do occasionally see a little touch of Moriarty and Sherlock, kinda, you know. But it's different when it comes to Radigan and Basil. They have practically no history in the movie besides being arch nemesis. Arch enemies. In the books, we do get a little bit more backstory in the form of us finding out that Radigan knows where Basil lives and has some kind of familiarity with Mrs. Judson. But beyond that, that's it. So we get to fill in the gaps ourselves. It is the widespread belief in the fandom that they are, to borrow the phrase, bitter ex-boyfriends, and the sheer amount of touching, the knowing swipes at each other to try to get under their skin, the rope play. It actually brings to mind this one fan fiction. Well, there's a couple of them. There's this one where Basil is tied to a chair and Radigan plays doctor with him, kind of. Like, the whole thing is that Radigan is saying that, but he doesn't. I think he just like, and then there's one where Radigan takes Basil's own tail and like and like gets it all and he uses it Basil. And the whole thing is like Basil really wants Radigan. So he like Radigan. I'm sorry. I know that this isn't at all an academic look at their relationship, but look at me. Do I look like I went to college? You know, don't answer that. Several of the fan fictions and art that surrounds these two characters can be pretty brutal. Nobody would tell you that they have or had a healthy relationship.
Which isn't at all to say that the fandom is only focused on the violent and messy relationship aspects of Basil and Ratigan. There is a great deal of fluff, fix-its, and of course, memes.
If I had to compare it to any other fandom, the closest I could probably come to would be Canogram, which is the 100% canon relationship between suit aficionado and cannibalistic serial killer Hannibal Lecter and Will Graham, the captain of my dreams. I personally have the belief that queer representation doesn't always need to be healthy or, inspirational in order for it to be enjoyable and valid. I mean, yeah, these aren't really the kind of people that you would want running your kid's elementary school bake sale, but that's kind of just the way it is. Queer, gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual, pansexual, and asexual people don't always have the most healthy, harmonious relationships, nor are they always the most healthy and harmonious people themselves. Sometimes they're not even kind. It just happens because they're people. People are complicated, they're nuanced, they're varied. I do think, though, out of all the Disney full-length feature films, The Great Mouse Detective might be the only one to have a queer-coded antagonist and a queer-coded protagonist. And I really like that about it. So I think that's it. I think that's all I wanted to say. I feel satisfied. I think I can go to sleep now.
Hi.
I thought I told you never to call this number.
Why, do you have another number I should use?
It's 4 a.m.
It's so cute that you still believe in time. Listen, I watched the movie you were talking about and it seems a little turfy. Is Ratigan supposed to be trans?
I hate this. I hate that I even have to think about it. But fine. Let's talk about it.
Alright, let me be clear. I don't think that there was any transphobic intention while writing or animating Ratigan. Indeed, I don't think he's really a trans character. He does desire power, and he does desire the power of the queen, but he doesn't want to be the queen herself. He wants to assimilate her power through the use of robotics and a sham marriage. Now, I think that if you're going to headcanon Ratigan or Basil or Dawson or any of the characters as trans, and you want to do it out of a place of love, that's perfectly fine. If you want to see more trans characters in mainstream culture and you use this as your way to do it, that's not a big deal to me. What does matter is the idea of transphobes and TERFs and people with personal prejudice using this character in a way to perpetuate hate. No, indeed, I think that Ratigan actually represents a different kind of prejudice. Anti-Irish prejudice. I can just hear your little fingers in the comment section right now. You little freak of nature, don't you know that Walt Disney was Irish? I want to remind you of something. Number 1, I can't read, so don't waste your time. Number 2, Walt Disney was dead. Now, it doesn't really matter to me whether or not he or Glenn Keane, who was the lead animator for Ratigan, were of Irish descent. I don't think it matters at all, because what matters is what Ratigan means to the world of The Great Mouse Detective. What he means to the film. And like Moriarty before him, Polrig Ratigan was of Irish descent. Now, we don't really see this in the movies at all. The only time that we even find out his first name is in the books. Polrig, I think, was a nod by Eve Titus to Moriarty's Irish descent. In the books, though, Ratigan is a fair bit different from the Ratigan we come to know from the film. He's still described as very tall. He is skeleton-like, though. He's very, very thin. He has a high, bulging brow, deep-set eyes. He speaks the Queen's English, similar to Basil. In the illustrations, though, he's a fair bit smaller than Basil. Basil looks positively beefy in comparison. See, the fact is that in the books, he's a mouse. Now, he is the only mouse to apparently own a suit of armor, which is how he is able to train Felicia the cat to work for him. And this is so different than the Ratigan we have come to know. According to people who worked in the production, early on, this was going to be the way Ratigan was portrayed, the same as the books. However, when Vincent Price stepped into the recording booth, they realized they wanted to make him a larger-than-life character. So Glenn Keane modeled his physicality off of then CEO at the time, Ron Miller. Ron Miller was 6'6" and a football player, so it makes sense. The rest of his physical attributes were based off of old photographs of Victorian gangsters. Now, Ratigan doesn't have a British or an Irish accent at all. He retains Vincent Price's perfectly wonderful American accent. And I think in a way we should expect this kind of difference from the look of our villain. If he were to remain the way that he was in the books, he would look a lot like Basil. Even if he were a tall and thin rat. Well, actually, come with me to the fridge for a minute.
Now, the size difference between Ratigan and Basil in the movie makes it pretty hard to figure out what kind of rat he really is. So I'm going to have to make a lot of assumptions here. My first assumption is that Ratigan would have been a black or ship rat, as the Norwegian brown rat is quite a bit bigger and the size difference would just be outrageous. So, if he's a black rat, they're usually about 11 inches long. Mice, on the other hand, are 4-5 inches maximum. And Basil is a very tall mouse, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say that Basil is 4.5 inches. So then 11 inches is just too huge for the size difference between them. And I've looked it up. I've tried to figure out how many heads tall, because that's an animation term, how many heads tall Ratigan is. They don't really say. They do say that Basil is about 4.5 heads tall, so that's where I came up with that number. Now, let's say that Ratigan is the runt of the litter. So he would be maybe 6 or 7 inches. That makes sense, right? Mice only have 4 fingers. Can we call them fingers? On their paw. Rats, on the other hand, have 5. Rats also have a completely different tail from mice. Mouse tails tend to be covered in fur. Short fur, but fur nonetheless. Rat tails are quite a bit longer, and they're naked, kind of scaly, almost segmented like a worm. What I'm trying to convey here is that if you were a citizen in Mousetoria, you would see Ratigan as an other. Now, when we do see the citizens of Mousetoria, all the high-class citizens anyway, in the Queen's Jubilee scene, they're all mice. They're all mice of similar color, similar height. In fact, the only time that we ever see a creature that isn't a mouse or a rat is either Toby and Felicia, who can't speak, and so we don't even know if they're smart or have any cognitive, capabilities. Which presents a whole other problem that I'm not even going to get into. But when we see characters such as Fidget, the bat, or Bill, the lizard, who shows up randomly, they're all criminals. Either that or they're in the seedy pub near the waterfront, which is supposed to be kind of a criminal hangout spot. So this raises a lot of questions. Questions I don't really know how to answer. For instance, I don't know the correlation for nationalities and which animal is which. I can deduce, however, that mice are likely English people, by and large. Which means that rats must be Irish. And if we're going to make the correlation that rats represent Irish people in this film, well, let's talk about it.
Huh. Wow, are olives always as salty?
There is a long and sordid history of anti-Irish prejudice in Britain and America, as well as much of the world, that can be traced through several centuries. The first record of anti-Irish sentiment goes all the way back to Greek geographer Strabo in about 17 AD, and he expressed that the Irish had too much sex, that they ate too much, that they didn't respect the vows of marriage, and that they were cannibals. And to me, this just sounds like Strabo wasn't invited to their parties and he was really sorry about it. But the sentiment carried on through several centuries, with the English papacy eventually invading Ireland in 1169. They declared the Irish to be rude, barbarous, and lazy, as they preferred to live without the concept of industry and didn't have the mercantile economy that the British were used to. Through several centuries of cruelty and brutality, Britain imposed its religion, Catholicism, and societal norms on Ireland. It is even more absurd that eventually, when Protestantism took over in England, they then used that to oppress and brutalize the Irish for adhering to the Catholicism that was forcibly imposed upon them earlier. You know, Irish people were stereotyped as violent, alcoholic, lazy, and criminal throughout the Victorian era and well into the 20th century. They were barred from work and housing opportunities in the form of Nina signs or no Irish need apply. They would be staunchly refused entry from pubs if they had an Irish accent or an Irish name. Intermarriage between Catholics and Protestants was strongly discouraged by both religious parties. Political cartoons often illustrated them as apish or animalistic, grotesque in some way. When Irish people eventually immigrated to America following disastrous famine, Theodore Roosevelt wrote in his diary,
"There are some 25 Irish Democrats in the House. They are a stupid, sodden, and vicious lot, most of them being equally deficient in brains and virtue. 3 or 4, however, seem to be pretty good men, but the average Catholic Irishman of first generation as represented in this assembly is a low, venal, corrupt, and unintelligent brute."
Does this in any way sound familiar to you? Is it just me?
And some, I assume, are good people.
No. Although Nina posters tended to fizzle out towards the beginning of the 1900s, other signage took their place, such as the No Irish, No Blacks, and No Dogs signs, which took prevalency in post-World War II era UK. Now, I won't go too far into the Troubles, which started in the late 60s, as that is an extremely dense topic, and this video is already longer than I anticipated, and I want to be able to devote the proper amount of time to that. Now, to this day, there is much to be said about anti-Irish prejudice, especially amongst loyalist Protestants with Irish heritage who prefer to see themselves as British and wish for a continued British presence and rule in Northern Ireland. Indeed, this is how a lot of Irish people assimilated into what can now be referred to as normal American culture by siding with their oppressors as white against black people, or against indigenous people, or indeed against people of color. What could be an easier way to make sure you're safe than to identify a common enemy, one who is more easily visible as an other than a last name, which can be changed, or an accent, which one can learn and adjust? This doesn't alter the degree to which some people still hate and discriminate against the Irish, but it has affiliated them by and large with the white identity. Now, I know nothing about Glenn Keane's intentions with making Radigan the ginormous, hulking brute that he later became in production. Nor do I really think that this was actually intentional. I don't think this is something anybody really thought through at all. I'm assuming that they wanted to make him vicious because he's a villain, and villains should be scary. And he does scare me. I mean, he nearly kills Basil, and the fight between them is horrifying and brutal and suspenseful. But when Radigan sheds his composed and high-class exterior to reveal a bloodthirsty rat, I think we should consider what that means for him. I think we should consider what Radigan went through to become a math professor in a mouse supremacist society, only to turn to a life of crime. Why he made those decisions, what his reasoning was. I mean, the movie tells us point blank that no matter how well Radigan may dress or how eloquently and genteel he may appear and speak, no matter how much power he amasses in society, he's always going to be a rat, and therefore another. Our hero Basil's first appearance is as a rather haunting stereotype depiction of a Chinese mouse, and he's not at all afraid of throwing the word rat in Radigan's face with the intent to hurt him. I want to believe that Basil, our hero, our protagonist, my boy, isn't racist, but I don't have any evidence for that. I'm not saying that anthropomorphic animal stories have no place in social critique. At the risk of sounding like a furry, have you seen Beastars yet? Look, okay, I'm not going to fault you for not watching it, and I'm not going to beg you to give it a shot. I'm just dropping it in because I'm going to be talking about it more next month. In the meantime, I do think that maybe you should give Jack Saint's videos about Beastars a try. They're very insightful, as well as his video about Zootopia, a movie which I just refuse to watch. Look, Disney isn't very good when it comes to handling these kinds of analogies. They often mix their metaphors and try to make one-to-one correlations between species and races or types of people. The human species is just that. It's one species. To compare, for instance, an herbivore and a carnivore to two different ethnicities is, how do I say, really, really bad in a way that sounds smart enough for you to believe me? What I'm trying to say is, wait, which camera is the one that goes directly at Disney headquarters? Disney. Baby. My guy. Papa. You've got to stop. There are rumors circulating the internet that you have a wish to remake this movie. I'm begging you. Don't do it. After what happened with The Lion King, I can only imagine how terrifying you would try to make a realistic Radigan or a realistic Basil. I don't need to see Basil looking like a real mouse. The whole point is that I'm able to think of him not as a mouse. The second you make him into a real mouse, I mean, what are you even going to do with a cast? You can't top the original cast. It's perfect. And they're dead. They're all dead. Do you understand? You can't do it. Are you even going to clothe these characters? Are we going to have to... Is there going to be a naked Dawson? Am I going to have to see rat balls? Huge pendulous rat balls 60 feet high? Don't answer that. Look, I'm coming to you mouse to mouse here. I understand that your biggest passion in the world is to just make tons of money. I get it. I mean, I love it, but I get it. But don't you have, like, every movie ever made now? Don't you own it all? So maybe it's time for a rest. You've told every story there is to tell, right? So just kind of take a little nappy nap. Let someone else drive the bus for a while so that the passengers don't keep hurling all over the seats. Maybe get a tattoo. Just a tattoo that says don't. Whatever font you want. I'll even hold your hand. Okay?
So, why would I say something as ridiculous as The Great Mouse Detective is the only film? I'm being facetious in a lot of ways. It's probably not even my #1 favorite movie. I do hope that Disney invests in a greater variety of storytellers for its future, as its handling of prejudice is often a problem with films. But I do think that what this movie taught me when I was younger continues to be important. Basil is just a mouse. Just like us, he's insignificant to the world. He can't affect global climate change in any meaningful way. He can't implement policies to improve the lives of marginalized people in any manner. He isn't supernaturally gifted like a great deal of the Marvel characters, or Star Wars characters, or even Disney princesses and their ineffable charm and beauty that wins them a life of luxury and ease, even if they have humble origins. He isn't by any stretch of the imagination a mouse of great physical strength. I mean, he's easily overpowered, and no matter how skilled he is at boxing, an animal with greater brawn is just going to crush him. While Sherlock Holmes came from wealth and doesn't have to live case to case, we can assume from the text that Basil is different and comes from humble origins, that what he knows he had to learn through eavesdropping and reading and conducting his own experiments. Sherlock Holmes was created, for better or worse, as a man of his time. And that time, there was an increasingly growing common sentiment that the police were inept, that instead of solving crimes, they were often criminal themselves, and that could not be more prescient to our current situation. For over 100 days, people have been protesting police brutality and corruption. Corruption that often favors the white and wealthy at the expense of Black lives, Indigenous lives, the lives of people of color, trans people, sex workers, and the poor. Now, the idea of a private detective who can apprehend murderers and criminals without harming the innocent and without utilizing funds that could be better spent building up the society that it actually winds up destroying, that gets dangerously close to a vigilante concept, and that is a concept worth dissecting in greater depth than I will go into during this video. In a smaller focus, Basil taught me that isolation and coldness for the sake of self-preservation comes at the cost of often extreme loneliness, and that being soft with the right people who can return your softness, and that can grant you opportunities to understand the world and yourself better than ever before. You can be the most intelligent person or mouse in the room, but if you're not thoughtful, if you're not kind, what good is it? I often find myself a bit soggy at the end of the movie at the idea of someone so inherently alone finding a healthy companionship, letting down his guard in such a direct manner. And as much as I love to paint the relationship between Dawson and Basil in romantic tones, the argument of whether or not it's queer doesn't really matter that much at the end. What is important is that the smartest mouse in the world learned something new. That in his endless pursuit of knowledge, Dawson gave him wisdom and safety. I hope that we can all learn to be wrong and grow from our mistakes. Being wrong isn't the end of the world. What is the end of the world is stubbornly believing something that isn't true, or using those false beliefs to cause harm and perpetuate hatred. I still have a lot to learn. I'm trying to learn all the time. It sucks. It's scary. You have to be vulnerable. You have to accept that you're not as perfect as you thought you were when you were a kid. That's okay. I hope that it's okay for you too. Good night. Or good morning, I guess.